Chapter 31. The Long Way Home. It was 1951, Falls Church, Virginia. Night. I was on my way to a senior play rehearsal. I'd stopped for the mail because I had applied to several colleges and was expecting answers any minute. Someone else was driving. I started to open the envelopes, forgetting for the moment that fat ones meant acceptance, thin ones rejection. We pulled up to a stop sign under a streetlight, and I looked twice to make sure I wasn't seeing things. A fat one. I'd been accepted to Stanford. I bolted from the car and ran back 3 blocks to our apartment. I'd already been accepted at Dartmouth, but Stanford was important. Not only because it was in the Ivy League of the West, which appealed to my father, who'd wanted to go to Harvard, but also because I'd probably be able to live at home in Palo Alto and save on expenses. I burst into the apartment, breathless, waving the contents of the envelope at my mother. She started to cry and reached for the phone to call my father, who by now was already working in San Francisco. Outside, my friends, who had followed me home, were honking persistently. If we didn't hurry, we'd be late for rehearsal. What a night. The hugging, the backslapping, the tears backstage, and after rehearsal, the celebration at the local drive-in. Almost everyone had heard from their respective colleges by then, and anticipation and nostalgia were already beginning to set in. When we weren't rehearsing, several of the same friends worked with me on the Jaguar, our high school yearbook, spread out on my living room floor. Formatting, editing, scribbling pages, which my mother typed up for us painstakingly at the dining room table. Or we were doing homework together, attending basketball, football, or baseball games, necking at parties at each other's houses, and slow dancing. We also cut classes and drove into Washington to movies at the Capitol Theater, where along with the films, there were comedians and lavish stage shows. I saw Martin and Lewis there, never dreaming that someday I'd be working with Jerry. I escorted Kitty Sue Lee to one basketball game, when her boyfriend, Fred Landis, was playing. I guess they both thought I was safe. I was, but I felt close to Kitty Sue, and I liked her very much. At halftime, I wandered into the parking lot and heard someone talking in a nearby car. I saw a match flare in the darkness, and an alluring voice said, "Hi." Joan Rollins, who was rumored to be hot and looked it, was in the car with another girl, and they invited me to join them. We smoked and chatted throughout the second half. Until then, we'd moved in different circles and had never really talked before, except passing each other in the hallways between classes. But during the second half of that basketball game, we became fast friends. It was a strange, exotic interlude. The feeling I had about it later was similar to what I'd experienced when I was younger and attending my first boy-girl parties. For some reason, I used to find myself alone in the kitchen with the barely pubescent hostess's mother, who was invariably more captivating and enticing. I might have also felt that way about Kitty Sue, but Fred had already spoken for her. At school, above all, my pals and I tried to avoid the Tasker brothers, Buddy and Billy. They were bullies who were rumored to have killed a kid in the boys' restroom. Presumably, they'd stood him up against a tiled wall, played patty cake, and belted him together. His head hit the tiles, and he died. At least that was the story. I know they tried to kill me one day when I was setting the marquee at the State, our local movie house, where I was working to earn money for the prom. It was late. I was standing on top of a tall ladder, heavy steel letters in hand, reaching for the railings that held the letters when the Taskers appeared below. They may have been coming out of the show, which I'm sure they snuck into through a back door. I sometimes left it ajar for friends. That threw the manager completely when he tried to compare ticket stubs with bodies and seats. He was not too bright. The Taskers barely hesitated, grabbed the ladder out from under me, and left me dangling by my fingertips from the edge of the marquee. I tried to hold on, swaying precariously as my grip began to loosen. My life didn't exactly flash before my eyes, but an incident when Buddy caught me talking to his girlfriend did, and vividly. He had not been happy about it, and the girl had distracted him, interrupting the impending assault. But he was happy enough now, laughing up at me and taunting me. Finally, at the last possible moment, as my fingers were slipping free, they replaced the ladder and sauntered off. But they didn't put it back exactly where it had been, the bastards, and I had to reach for it with the toe of my shoe and ease it into position. When it was all over, and I was on safe ground again, I looked up to check the lettering on the marquee. I'd put a B in the asphalt jungle. I had developed friendships in two distinct, close-knit groups. One was centered on Falls Church High, where none of my friends were Jewish. The other around the synagogue, where, naturally, everyone was. At Falls Church, I helped start a kind of poor man's fraternity, Zeta Chi, to compare with the popular jocks. We couldn't afford fraternity pins, and we weren't really a fraternity. We just used the Zeta Chi chapter letters dangling from a short chain to identify ourselves. Our behavior was unpredictable, our dress eccentric, and we soon became as popular and visible as the others, particularly when the principal, General Rumbaugh, retired from the military but still a martinet, tried to throw us out of school for some infraction, which we considered mere boyish enthusiasm. One of our major successes was sponsoring a dance with a Hawaiian theme, featuring phony greenery borrowed from a local mortuary. Lee Phillips was my buddy at Falls Church. He lived on a small farm in the nearby countryside, and I liked to visit there. We fooled around, did chores, rode the two recalcitrant horses, one of which bit me on the thigh. Lee was full of fun. Driving around town, we'd yell, "Milk it or move it," or "Drag your ass to the wall," at other motorists, then peel away. At my house, when Mom asked if he'd like second helpings, his standard reply was, "I guess I could choke down another morsel." We double dated to the senior prom, although he was a year behind me, and he married his high school sweetheart, Electa Larkin. My dad called him Leaky, and when my grandmother came to visit, and Lee was there, she fussed over him, which was definitely out of character for her, and insisted she liked him so much that he must be Jewish. My best Jewish friend was Stanley Cohen, and I used to hang out with him and his younger brother Ricky. Almost 20 years later, Deborah and I looked Stanley up during a trip to Washington with the kids. He was, as expected, running his father's men's clothing store, Martin's Menswear, and still living in Arlington. I was glad that he seemed so familiar and looked much the same, although he had clearly grown more sober. He reminded me that my parents had introduced him to classical music and the theater, and I recalled how he and his father had taken me to my first pro baseball game. Stanley owned a tiny Crosley car when we were in high school. It looked like one of those cars that a dozen circus clowns used to tumble out of, but it barely held 4 people. We'd drive into downtown Washington, where parking was scarce, even then, with 2 Confederates crammed in the back. Stanley would find a space too small for anything and double park. Then the 4 of us would squeeze out, lift the car up, and put it down in the space, neatly against the curb. Half of the fun came from the looks we got from envious drivers and astonished pedestrians. I remember one night, we drove into D.C. in the Crosley and went to a club. I think it was the Blue Note, to hear Louis Armstrong. I guess we lied about our age to get in. Armstrong was playing with a small group, and I seem to remember that trombonist Jack Teagarden was one of the players. I think Cozy Cole was the drummer. We tossed for it, and I was the one who went to the booth in the back when the musicians took a break and asked for their autographs. In addition to the popular Washington Lee High Choir, I sang again in the Stanford Chorus and later in a barbershop group. During 2 high school summers, I went to Manzanetta Music Camp. Once on a scholarship arranged by Miss Booker, our devoted choir director. I think I've mentioned that before, but you can't say enough about Miss B. At camp, I struggled with asthma attacks, and one night, a doctor came out from town to give me an adrenaline shot. We slept in dorms with 3-quarter partitions between rooms, Voices could be heard late into the night over the walls, voices of strangers talking, laughing, getting acquainted, raising and resolving various worldly issues. One night, my bunkmates and I had pretty much exhausted the topic of sex, and we were tackling religion. In a conversational lull, I mentioned that I was Jewish. Suddenly, silence. Then bodies came hurtling over the 3/4 wall between us and the next room, and I was surrounded in the darkness. I prepared for the assault, but it came unexpectedly in the form of questions. Apparently, I was a novelty, and they were curious. We talked for hours. Next day, boys I couldn't recognize from the previous night's shadowy encounter came up to me, shook hands, patted my shoulder, walked with me to the dining room or the next rehearsal. Suddenly we were friends, and all day long we sang together. On the day of our high school graduation, it rained. Hard. The planned outdoor celebration was moved into the local movie theater, the State, where the Taskers had almost killed me. Afterward, we tried to hold on to each other and the moment just a little longer. But gradually, everyone parted and moved off in a family cluster. My father came back from San Francisco. He'd rented a house for us in Palo Alto, not far from the university. He was preoccupied with the prospect of passing the California bar exam and concerned. He was planning to take some classes. A few days passed, and we finished packing. Then we started on our cross-country journey to a new life and a new home, crammed tight in the family car, a '49 Chevy I had been driving while my father was away. We traveled leisurely for 2 weeks, having a rare and wonderful time together. Except for the night we were soundly asleep in a painfully plain motel in a small, isolated town, and a fire broke out in someone's barn. We woke up to the sounds of horns honking, cars and trucks racing past, and my father, disoriented like the rest of us, urged us out into the parking lot and into the car. We threw our things in and took off. Some distance from town, my father slowed the car and we looked back. The fire was plainly visible, a patch of color in the night sky, but it was obviously contained to the area of the barn, which was in a big, open field, and we began to feel sheepish about running away. Dad protested, but my brother and I persuaded him to turn around, and in a few moments, my mother and Roy were tucked in back at the motel, and Dad and I were on the fire line at the barn, holding on to the cumbersome hose with other men and passing buckets as the fire was slowly vanquished. I felt a kind of comforting solidarity with everyone, all those strangers, and with my father. In the morning, in the next-door coffee shop, we were able to look people in the eye and exchange friendly smiles because they'd seen us there at the fire. I had thought of those events as we continued across the country, and often since I have thought about my father's instinct to rush us to safety when it looked like the entire matchstick town might go up in flames. And although he's gone now, whenever I recall that journey to our new home, I feel close to my father, and I feel his comfort once again.